Pokemon abilities are one of my favorite things to talk about on this channel, and today we're going to be talking about Pokemon abilities that I find underrated by one way or another. While the word underrated typically refers to some kind of common perception, for the point of this video I'm going to be using it more in terms of untapped potential. I made a previous video where I talked about really bad Pokemon with really overpowered abilities, and just so I don't start repeating myself, I'm not going to mention any of those abilities in today's video. The first abilities I want to talk about are Huge Power and Pure Power, which both do the same thing, they just double your Pokemon's attack stat. And people are already pretty aware that these are very strong abilities, but I think the extent of how just damn ridiculously strong these abilities are only becomes apparent once you start looking at the numbers. It's a pretty common misconception that what this ability does is it doubles the base stat of the Pokemon, so it will take a Pokemon like Medicham with 60 base attack and it will give it essentially 120 base attack. And what it actually does is it doubles just the stat proper of the Pokemon, which is what appears on the little sidebar here, and is more as a product of the base stat and then the EVs and then the nature to get the final just stat of the Pokemon. Now this might sound like more of an actually thing than something that actually matters, but once you look at the stats, this becomes a crazy difference. So let's think about it. The highest non-mega attack stat for a Pokemon with huge or pure power is Medicham, who has base 60 attack. And if you give it 252 EVs, which is the max, and an adamant nature, it ends up at being 240 attack. So, if we were to take the incorrect definition and double the base attack, that would end up at 120, which we can take a Pokemon like Dragapult, which has 120 base attack, and if we give it max EVs and also a plus attack nature, it'll end up at 372 attack. So if we were to take the correct definition of pure power and double 240, which is Medicham's attack stat, that ends up at 480. A whopping 108 points higher than Dragapult. Yeah, that's a pretty damn big difference. And if you want a real comparison, Kyurem Black at 170 base attack, if you were to do the same thing with EVs in nature, would end up at 482. You can see the difference here. To put Pure Power into even more perspective, if you were to take the highest attack in the game's history, which is currently Mega Mewtwo X with 190 base attack and 526 total attack, you would only need 71 base attack to reach that with Pure Power. To put this into perspective, there's only one base 71 attack Pokemon in the game currently, and it's Scorbunny. For God's sake, you can make Shuppet hit harder than Mega Mewtwo X with this ability. So if you're wondering why this ability is on my underrated section, now imagine if a Pokemon with base 90 or 100 had this ability. That would easily be the strongest Pokemon in history, by far. Game Freak was very clearly aware of this and definitely danced around which Pokemon they gave the abilities to make it a more balanced ability, despite having just a ridiculous definition. Now the next ability I want to talk about is Contrary, which I already briefly touched on in my ranking drawback abilities video, card on screen now if you want to watch that, but I think there are two things that we need to look at to figure out why Contrary is such an underrated ability in my opinion. So let's take a look at the list of Pokemon that have Contrary. The first is Enamorus, Serperior, Lurantis, Malamar, Shuckle, and Spinda. Now if we look at this list, what we'll notice is that none of these Pokemon have two things in common. The first is being a good Pokemon without Contrary. In fact, the only Pokemon on this list would be Enamorus, because Serperior was NU before it got the ability, and the others are just pretty terrible Pokemon. And the other thing to notice is that there are only two of them, being Serperior and Lurantis, which have stab moves that are affected by Contrary. Now, there are actually plenty of Pokemon with moves like Serperior and Lurantis, which drop your special attack for very high base power. The two most notable ones, in my opinion, are Overheat and Draco Meteor, because if we were to take a Pokemon with these two moves and we were to slap on Contrary, it would be pretty damn broken. Just for a minute, imagine Heatran if it were firing off Contrary Overheats, and every time it used Overheat, it boosted its special attack by 2. That seems pretty ridiculous, right? Now let's think more about the Dragon type. Specifically, I want to think about Latios and Dragapult, and imagine if they were dropping Draco Meteors, which boosted your special attack by 2. That seems pretty damn ridiculous now, doesn't it? It's another ability that Pokemon can make very good use of, which we have seen with Serperior, but we just haven't had any Pokemon that push it over the edge into the top tier of Pokemon ability, so to speak. Now we're going to move on to one which is a little less strong, but I think it's very strongly underrated just by common perception, and that's going to be Comatose, the signature ability of Kamala. So what Comatose does is it just pretends that the Pokemon is asleep at all times, and while this does have some interesting side effects, the primary effect that I want to talk about is it prevents the Pokemon from being statused at all. Now for the viewers more versed with competitive Pokemon, it might just sound like worse Magikarp, Magikarp being an ability that prevents any damage from a non-direct source, such as entry hazards, or poison, or burn, for example. But there is an important distinction between Comatose and Magikarp, being that it prevents any status. The most important application of this being you don't get paralyzed. And Pokemon like Clefable, despite having Magikarp, can still be paralyzed. They still take the speed hit from paralysis. They also can't be frozen, which is a little less important, but it's also just something on top of that. Comatose isn't a world-beating ability, but I think it's still pretty underrated just because of that important distinction from Magikarp that you can't be paralyzed whatsoever, just because paralysis is such an important status. The next ability I want to talk about is No Guard, which is another ability that I talked about in the ranking the drawback abilities video, but I want to talk about it once again a little bit more in depth here. No Guard is an ability where every move that you use and every move that your opponent uses against you will always hit. And note that this is different than 100 accuracy. This is more like a move like Aura Sphere, which instead does not check accuracy, which means that if you have lower accuracy or if your opponent has higher evasion, it completely ignores that, it just hits. The main issue with this ability is that Pokemon tend to either just have one move that uses this, or they tend to have a couple of moves which don't really matter too much that the Pokemon has No Guard. An example of the first type here would be a Pokemon like Machamp, which, despite not even really running No Guard to begin with, would run a move like Dynamic Punch, which has 50 accuracy before, but now he can have a pretty solid base power move, which also has the guaranteed confusion effect. As I just mentioned though, having one move that is affected by No Guard is just not really very useful, and that's why Machamp typically runs Guts instead of No Guard. An example of the latter type would be a Pokemon like Golurk, who frequently runs moves like Poltergeist and Stone Edge, which have 90 and 80 accuracy respectively, and while having these moves not check accuracy is nice, it's really not anything game-breaking, as you're typically relying on these moves to hit anyway, and if they miss, it's just like a damn, I'll get him next time sort of thing, rather than anything crazy. So Game Freak, if anyone is watching, please, for Generation 10, have a Pokemon which has No Guard, which has Inferno and Zap Cannon. That is the Pokemon that I want to see. I want to be landing my 100 base power, no accuracy, 100% paralysis, and 100% burn rate moves. That is what I want. And on a more realistic note, even a Pokemon like Zapdos would make very good use of this ability, because it could be using moves like Thunder and have them not worry about accuracy, so you can have a big strong attack and also have a high paralysis chance. And same thing with something like Hurricane, you can have that big strong move, not have to worry about accuracy, and then have the added bonus of the confusion rate on top of it. Unfortunately, I don't think No Guard works with one-hit KO moves, but imagine how funny it would also be to have a Pokemon with like 5 base speed like Shuckle, have No Guard, and then like Guillotine or whatever one-hit KO move. That would be funny. Like, it wouldn't be very competitively interesting or remotely competitive, but it would just be funny. The last ability I want to talk about today is Sniper, which makes your critical damage 2.25 instead of 1.5. Now, if I made this video a couple of generations ago, I probably wouldn't have talked about Sniper just because it would have been incredibly inconsistent, or you would have had to use something like Focus Energy or something to take advantage of, which just isn't really consistent enough, and the only Pokemon who are able to take advantage of it are like Kingdra, and that's kind of it. However, this is now Generation 9, and for some reason, in the past couple of generations, the developers have been on a kick of giving Pokemon really strong auto-crit moves. The two most notable Pokemon with these types of moves are Meowscarada with Flower Trick and Urshifu with Wicked Blow / Surging Strikes. These moves already do some pretty crazy damage, but with Sniper on top of that, the base power can get to insane levels. Flower Trick being 70 base power goes all the way up to 157 base power with Sniper, and keep in mind that this goes through any defense boost that the opponent might have. And Wicked Blow and Surging Strike both go from 75 total to 168 base power moves. Moving on from those specific Pokemon, even moves like Frost Breath, which are only 60 or so base power, get pretty massive boosts when you put on the Sniper critical hit damage bonus. As I just mentioned, Frost Breath goes all the way from 60 base power to 130, being 20 damage more powerful than Blizzard with 20% more accuracy. Anyway, there's a short list of underrated Pokemon abilities in my opinion. Let me know what you think down in the comments, any abilities that you would add to this list, and have a good day.